Welcome to a new episode of the Creative Industry Insight podcast. I'm your host, Bobby. Fresh off their Emmy nomination for his work on Apple TV's Sugar, we welcome cinematographer Richard Rutkowski A.S.C. Richard will talk us through his work on episodes 3, 4, and 7 of Sugar. Please be warned that there are heavy spoilers in this episode. Now let's jump into the conversation with Richard. Hi, Richard. Thank you for joining me today.
I'm glad to be here, Robert.
We're here to talk about Apple TV's Sugar, which you've recently received a Emmy nomination for the episode Starry Eyed. I think before we jump in and talk about the project, how have you found the reaction to the show and to the Emmy nomination?
Well, I was pleasantly surprised by the Emmy nomination. Sugar was not a show that was receiving a lot of publicity. It was not on the order of Fallout or Ripley or any of the shows that were receiving a huge push towards the Emmy nominations. And it is a show I'm very proud of. And I feel like it was discovered as a sort of sleeper. I think I started getting texts and emails from fellow camera persons maybe 2 months after it was released. And there was a lot of general praise for it and also some specific questions. People were literally asking certain questions about the look for Los Angeles. And I sort of knew at that point that it was receiving good attention from the cinematographer community. And in that cinematographers do the nominating, I'm just extremely honored because I know how I look at shows when I'm asked to, choose, make judgments, select for the A.S.C. awards. And I try to look not at the hoopla or the excitement around a show, but about the specifics of the photography and where I'm seeing something different or something that really inspires me. So I feel like that's been the case here, and I'm just incredibly grateful. And in that, the show was sort of finding its feet while we were making it in some ways. And of course, it was very adventuresomely imagined by the Block One director, Fernando Moraes, and his cinematographer, Cesar. I'm just so proud to be associated and to be partners with them in this, and happy to see the show get some recognition.
I guess there's like one thing, like when you start getting messages from people, then you know that something's up, right? When you have people reaching out and saying, "Oh, I really enjoyed this. I like this part of it." There's probably a nice like little pat on the back for yourself. But then also when you have your peers reaching out, then that's probably like that's even a bigger thing because then, as you said, like people are not surrounded by the hoopla of it. It's more of a what's inspired them and what they've enjoyed.
Yeah, and I think it also was connected to the entirety of the production. Colin Farrell is an extraordinarily good leading man, and he's very skilled with camera. Adam Arkin, my director, has a long history of doing great work, both as an actor and a director. And I'd worked with Adam once before on The Americans and really enjoyed the experience. And then we had a great production designer, Tom Foden, Christine Wittenborn, the costumes. And in general, it was interesting to see Los Angeles represented in its present day, but in a sort of, look back nostalgic fashion to the type of filmmaking that has legendarily occurred there. And we had a lot of fun with that language. And I think what I've heard from people is that yes, there are plot surprises, and yes, there are oddball deviations from what you might expect, and that's what they enjoyed in the end. Not every critic enjoyed it, but the people watching enjoyed it. And I'm honored and happy, and I'm representing a team. I had a great crew and terrific producers willing to be able to see things as we were seeing them. I thought it was great.
And then I guess we'll touch upon like LA because I think that is a big thing that as like film and TV, it feels like LA is very romanticized and you don't see the modern day side of it. A lot of times that like if you talk about LA, like there's a way of like films that pop into mind, stuff like LA Confidential, for example, and it's that sort of romanticism rather than the modern day. And it's quite nice to see that in a show like this and see it sort of like in a different sort of light as well.
Yeah, you bring up LA Confidential, which was something we discussed in prep because, of course, the casting involved James Cromwell. And James Cromwell for film buffs, and I think this show rewards film buffs, is a specific reference. He's the villain there, and he becomes the villain with us. Another show we like to talk about was The Long Goodbye. And we also talked a bit about To Live and Die in LA, which had at its time a very bold representation of the city. And it represented, that film represented the underworld of the city. In Sugar, Block One sort of starts with the high end, you know, James Cromwell's home, Jonathan Siegel's home is a dreamboat of a mansion up on a hill. And then slowly you start to discover all the underpinnings of the family secrets and the family corruption. And it's an interesting meta language between what you're seeing on screen, where it's made, what histories are being related, and even to reference Chinatown, which it does very clearly. And we did not want to copy these films, but we knew we had to acknowledge their existence and at least either go against them or embrace some part of them. So specific to Chinatown, Adam and I embraced the idea that the camera can and should be often very close to Sugar, that Sugar is our detective and he's discovering and he's leading us. Now, of course, what becomes apparent and is also a famous line in noir detective stories is that the hero is actually discovering something about himself. And so that's the part we always had in mind. This is examination of his case, quote unquote. It's also his own history and then eventually his own identity. And so a lot of the cinematography choices were motivated that way.
Just you mentioned The Long Goodbye. Yeah, what a film that film is, and what a great reference to use as well. That's another one that's like, if anyone hasn't seen that, it's like treat yourself, because that is a really good film. But in terms of your research, because we're touching upon it now, how did you want to sort of, because there's two DOPs, what sort of discussions did you have with each other regarding the look of the show? Because I can imagine that there is like a through line of how everything's going to be. You mentioned it with like how tight you are with Colin Farrell in his scenes, which is quite noticeable as well because it's very, I guess, depending on the size of the screen, you've got a very big, handsome man on your screen, and it just works really well with how he's acting and analyzing the situation and the scenes. But with the discussions, how did you go about creating a through line for the look, but then also having your own little spin on the show as well?
Well, I would love to tell you that there was some grand theoretical fundamental conversation, but I would say that it was more a partnership of feeling adventuresome and trying things. And what I really took away within 2 days of being in LA and prep with Cesar is that this older man was as experimental as they get. He's not from the Hollywood system. He's a filmmaker from South America. He's, you know, got decades of history with Fernando Moraes, and those films do not look like other films, and they certainly don't look like standard streaming television. And they were looking outside the box on every option, and their shooting style combined multiple perspectives and even like iPhones with macro adapters up close to things or down on hands or underwater. And so that adventuresome spirit was what carried through. That's where we dovetailed. When we get into the work Adam and I were doing, we're introducing new characters and scenarios that are sort of part of the lower world of Sugar. So things necessarily shift a little bit. And we were also dealing more with the sort of meta nature of the information delivered on screens, a very modern idea that some of the narrative shows up on screens. Then eventually we show a classic movie, which is itself a clue. And then the movie that Colin references at the beginning of Starry-Eyed when he's describing to his doctor, Vickers, the scene from The Thing, which is, of course, wildly memorable if you're my age. And then what's happening at the back end of episode 4 is Jonathan Siegel's having EKG put on him by paramedics, and it's eerie. And that's the goal, is to bring out these themes and bring out these resonances, hopefully with some sleight of hand so it doesn't feel too forced, and with a little bit of a nod and a wink, but not too much. And I think Colin's work really exemplifies that. He knew how to work with a camera close to him or following him. He really helped us many, many times because we would be moving cameras during photography, like the scene where he's there to listen to the victim of Davy's date rape, and extortion. He's there listening to her. People are always commenting to me how beautiful her acting was and how unusual our coverage of her was. And I like to point out that it works also because when you go to Amy and Colin's reactions, they feel incredibly subtle and authentic. And so it carries for the audience, the difficulty of hearing this from someone and understanding that you now have this information and have to act on it. And I support the writing. It all starts on the page. As regards Cesar and I communicating, it was one of the easiest communications ever. I had a great deal of respect for him, and I came to learn that he respected me. He took a look at work I had done, or he took a look at what I was achieving in the dailies, and he was very encouraging, and so was Fernando. And rather than a big conversation, I'll take that. It worked out.
I guess again, like when people talk about film and TV making, that's the magic of it, right? Especially you don't know how a show is going to turn out until probably you've seen the dailies for a number of days because you can't get context, but you kind of have to you kind of sort of let it all play out and then see how you're doing. But I guess at the same time, when you have actors sort of bringing their A game, it must make it so much easier for you just to capture everything when you're getting certain close-ups and allowing an actor to know how to play to the camera when it's so close to them. But do you ever worry that your camera might get in the way of how they're moving and how they're performing, just because you're so close to them?
Yes, and especially this technique of bringing in iPhones additional to the main cameras. The main cameras were the Sony Venice, a more traditional way of capturing television or streaming content. And then we were experimenting with iPhones, and sometimes I had these little Sony RXOs going. And yes, you worry at the same time after a couple days photography, and Cesar had started this in his block. It became clear that was part of our language. So for instance, at the beginning of episode 3, we discover Sugar sleeping on a chair in his hotel suite because the dog makes it impossible for him to sleep in his own bed. And Colin was incredibly intuitive about, oh, they're placing the camera there. I'll act with this part of things. They're behind my ear. I'll act with that part of things. And I salute that, but I also recognize that thanks to the work Fernando brought and Fernando's legacy, I mean, these are not choices that were not already there in the Fernando Moraes catalog, but the actors warmed up to it and took to it. And it's not like the normal thing where you give them a whole run to do and you don't move the camera. The camera was moving during their performance to get the next piece of coverage. And I liked the interplay. It felt jazz-like. That it eventually seems very coherent is something you worry about while you're doing the photography. You worry, how's this going to cut? But you worry about that when you do more traditional coverage as well. So I feel like I learned a lot and stretched myself, certainly, and also the crew felt energized by these choices. And there you go. Then it became a very cool show. The thing I can feel most proud of is that they can cut away to these classic references of film noir, and we don't suddenly seem an inferior work when they come back to what we're doing. In fact, by going away to those pieces and coming back, we've added a thread to the tapestry of Sugar, and I like it. I like it very much.
I think that's one thing as well. Like I like the cutting between the show itself, and then films that it might be referencing to, just because as well. I guess if people are interested in films and TV, it's such a rich way of being like, oh, maybe I should check out that film if it's referencing this, or maybe I can find out what the list of films that they're referencing in the show to go back and check out and see how it might tie into one another. I think that's a really clever sort of Easter egg of how you'll let something play out. And I guess as like I don't know how it's written on the script, if it's a case of like the scene's written and then it just says cut to insert of this film.
No,
But
it was not part of the script. It was understood as part of the language, but it was not specifically scripted in, which was interesting in its own right. Whereas the Winds of Change, that whole scene where we show a fake vintage film, was written in and did introduce this issue of like, if you're going to now go in this direction with the photography to create a fake vintage film, how does it feel then to come back to our digital photography, modern day LA? And I did have some concern, like if I do this very stylized piece and they start using it full screen, which they did at some points, and even Fernando's block flashed back to it because it's a clue in the work, is it going to feel like it's disjoined? But no, oh, it was great. A real revelation. You can go to this highly stylized, high key color, Douglas Sirk like image, and then you can come back to your photography and they're reinforcing each other, not the opposite way around. And I feel very good about all that. I feel glad we were allowed to make that film, like make it on film, projected on film. It again, another texture, an iPhone, a 35 millimeter anamorphic, our Sony Venice photography, sometimes quite roughed up a little bit in the way it's presented. And so I'm glad it came out well.
what is it like though to be working over so many different formats? Just because I guess to general audiences, each one is so different in the way that it's presented. So with film, you could have different stock, and depending on the lighting, you might need to change the stock on lighting. And then iPhone, well, you can get apps to help you with it, but I'm just going to go under the assumption that you use the camera app where it's kind of all automatic, and then you have digital where it's kind of similar to film that you have to work with the lighting to make sure that you can create the 3D image. What was that like, sort of working with all three across the show?
Well, it somewhat reminded me that in each situation, in each format, you're seeking to control the basics: focus, exposure, contrast, grain if you're having it or adding it. And the cinematic, I think it was a Cinema Pro or something on the iPhone. It was very flexible in terms of helping you get your exposure right. And you're exploiting the strength of each part. So the strength of the iPhone was that you could come in very close with the performer, or you could plant it inside the car moving in the daytime and get yourself an angle that wouldn't have been possible otherwise while you filmed the car more traditionally from the side or front with the Sony Venice. The other trick with the iPhone that was fun was Cesar put it underwater, which was bold. We later did in episode 3 an underwater sequence with a normal, hydroscope and hydroflex underwater housing because we had to travel with him swimming at night and everything like that. But it showed that you could have these all in the same container and that it worked. And that again, I keep using the word adventuresome or let's just do it was the theme. And that really opened up those options, while at the same time reminding me that the technique of control in the different formats is quite often the same. I'm always looking for the correct exposure. I'm always looking for where the lens most benefits the context and character. And I'm always looking for where the information forwards the underlying tones of the script, the sort of the subtext becomes fleshed out visually, whether or not you accept it at the moment you're watching, because I think most people watch the performer and listen to the dialogue. But I like to create frames where the subtext is also present. And on a second, a third viewing, or even if you just watch it silent, sometimes I've been watching it silent to do the color grading. I'm like, oh yeah, that happened. And I'm not even sure I was conscious of making that frame at that time, but it's just the right frame. So
That's quite interesting though, isn't like when you say like if I know if you at the time you weren't making the conscious sort of effort, it was I think maybe it's probably the best way to say it is like going with a gut feeling in how you're creating shows because as well we're talking off camera, you've had 30 years of experience, so you would know that you're sort of ins and outs of how to do it all. But I think as well with creativity can be so unpredictable because one moment you'll be thinking about one thing and then it could create another spark of like actually if we did it this way it could look even better. And I'm not, of course, you guys plan out and prep the show, but then there's always there's a little bit of improvisation on the day of like wasn't quite right what we had in mind. Maybe if we just move it a little bit, then it could work.
It's an interaction among all the people. It's the camera operator, focus puller, gaffer, myself, the director, the performer. It's an interaction. And anyone who tells you that there's an auteur moment that someone completely owns, I'm not sure that's ever true in film. I think the best directors understand the partnerships, and the best actors are listeners as well as speakers. And the best crew are observers and often bring forward a way of doing something that I wasn't thinking about that's better. I'd like to bring up a sequence that is very dear to me that I think is a good example of what I'm talking about. Sugar makes his way up to the balcony and then the projection room of this theater before the Lorraine Everly retrospective begins to screen. And there's something about that journey up the stairs. He's, of course, following Melanie, and then into the balcony space and into the projection room that feels very tied to traditional noir moments in a detective story. We follow him to a piece of information. And then he meets the projectionist, and the projectionist is busy with threading the beautiful big projector. Of course, I have a fetishistic attachment to a beautiful projector with a anamorphic attachment on the front, but he's preparing to show something. Sugar wanders the room and realizes there's the grid of security cameras with the option for him to spy on all of the people he's been trying to unearth secrets from. And Sugar's there to find something. So it's that duality. We're going to show something on a print, a fixed medium with an outcome determined by the creators of the film. In this case, it's saying that it's like 50 years ago or more. And then there's Sugar dealing with live input from multiple security cameras, and he's finding something rather than showing something. And actually the photography of that scene worked out well. We're close on Sugar's face in a way that we hadn't been before. And he has that beautiful line about, you don't know what you find out about human beings until you watch it on film, or it's amazing what a film can tell you about human beings, which is a tell for our greater mystery. I just feel like in that scene, as simply as it was done, there's not a lot of razzmatazz to the photography. It has nice lighting, but it is not dramatically backlit or otherwise juiced. I feel a connection to what I had hoped for in the show, which is to unearth more complex undercurrents in photography, simply, believably, attractively.
Yeah, because talking about that scene, I think there's like a weird intimacy to it, right? There's like I think there's like a bit of intimacy and voyeurism to it all, right? So you have that intimacy of being in the projection booth where sort of like where magic happens and somebody's loading up the film and is about to show this to everybody. And I feel like if you're projecting this and you're in those booths, you kind of have a different perspective in terms of like you get to watch the audience's reaction to what's being shown on screen. And I think with like Sugar watching the CCTV element as well, is that he's getting that sort of like a different kind of projection sent to him. Maybe I'm just talking rubbish. I
No,
don't know,
no,
but
it's entirely perfect what you're saying. We deliver a privileged point of view on Sugar. In other words, his projectionist who's behind his back there doesn't get to see the look on his face as he says that dialogue looking at the security camera footage. We do. And much like when you're alone with a private detective or any protagonist and you show the audience a moment that is uniquely theirs by themselves for you to see, that privileged point of view is a very powerful part of storytelling. And it can happen in a crowd as well. We've seen those scenes. And it can happen in combat with bullets flying around. You spend that moment with the character uniquely experiencing that. And it's a very powerful way of communicating. It's very cinematic. Now, you mentioned the projectionist watching the film, watching the audience. That's what I did when I was 19 years old. I was the projectionist at my college, spending my weekends screening Love Story and Lethal Weapon for teenagers to come to with ice cream afterwards. I did learn something from watching the work of different directors in those mediums. I learned a good deal about Indiana Jones by screening 4 times the Indiana Jones films, and breaking down, okay, this is what's pointing to this. This is how this best communicates. You can learn a lot as the projectionist, and yes, you learn where the laughs arrive, and you learn where audiences go quiet. They're not fidgeting, and I believe I've taken that away. I hope it would be nice if I had.
I guess that's like a really cool, interesting like tidbit because, or one, you probably know some of those films like the back of your hand, probably how many times you've seen them. But then also, I wonder what it must have been like to be like, oh, this is a bit where people are gonna gasp because it's like, what a spectacle, or they would laugh at something. That would probably be something that would be pretty cool as well.
Well,
Um,
one thing I'll say too is when you're in the projection room, we had a very crude little speaker that brought the sound into the projection room. In the audience, there's big, beautiful speakers projecting announcing the sound from the optical track. What I heard was muffled and kind of a little thin, but I also had a monitor to hear into the audience because you're listening to see if anything is wrong, and more than once projections snap and you have to stop and announce, give us 2 minutes and you reconnect on the splicer. But point being, having the visual be the principal part of what I was doing was very instructive. And I believe sound is absolutely very, very powerful and important, and quite often does work that is more intuitive to the audience than the visual being representative of reality. Sound can be more abstract. But the way I watched those films and was barely hearing the soundtrack, but able to stare out over the heads of people, it did help. It did help build a vocabulary. And those were all popular movies. At the same time, I was in classes examining Eastern European cinema, Asian cinema, 1920s silent cinema. So I felt, I had an immersion at that point in my life, and it's come back. It's come back as supremely helpful.
Again, these are the funny sort of moments in life where you'll be taught something or you'll be learning something where you have no idea when it will become useful, but somehow it like becomes a full circle. I've had that in my life learning Polish, for example, thinking when I was
Oh,
younger, going to Polish school on Saturdays, and
hmm.
then now it's actually become so useful that it's like, well, mum and dad were right.
Especially if you're going to camera image.
Yeah, exactly. I've just got a couple of questions because I know we might be short for a bit of time. So my penultimate question is, what was your favorite scene that you didn't shoot?
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, it's a tough one, isn't it?
Well, what's a little unfair is that there's different scenes for different moods or modalities. So in episode, I want to say episode 6, or is it 8? In any case, in one of the later episodes, they had Sugar go to the bad guy's house, the house up on the hill by the oil wells, and he has to do something he doesn't want to do, which is hurt people, and he has to have a shootout and it's very violent and it's very stylistic. And for that part of the story, they did a great job with that. Then again, right in the first episode, Sugar is ushered by a butler or a lawyer, sorry, Sugar's ushered by a lawyer to meet Jonathan in these chairs in front of his lush garden of his, Beverly Hills home. And that scene was interesting. That scene seemed set up in a certain way. And then when you got into the photography of it, it was very different. And then it bled into them going into the house and into the kitchen, all of which felt very unique. And having read it on the page and actually visited set while they were making it, I didn't see that outcome, and I was very inspired by it to watch. And I guess lastly, I shot some of the work that flashes back to the infrared photography of the alien planet, but I didn't shoot the majority of that work with Sugar and his sister sort of flash back to his real self on the planet. And I thought that was quite beautiful. And I thought it came out, having tested the infrared and been involved in like, how is this going to help, or what do we have to watch out for? I was very impressed by the outcome of that and the handling of it. And so I don't know what to say. I have lots of scenes that I think are very good in the work Fernando and Cesar did. I know from Cesar's wonderful emails that he felt a partnership and that he liked the work we did. And I can't ask for more. I really can't. I mean, that's a person I enormously respect. So whatever approbation came its way, I'll always base my satisfaction on the fact that as collaborators, we enjoyed each other's work.
Okay. I guess sometimes it's very difficult to pick what the best your sort of like best scenes are because there's always something that might mean something to you. So my next question might be a little bit of cheating because I was going to say what was your favorite scene to shoot, but that might be like asking what your favorite child is. So it might be very difficult. Um,
Well, there are several, there are several scenes that were fun and a joy, and it's for different reasons. And that's why it's like in a silo, like favorite scene like this, favorite scene like that, favorite scene over here. So when we filmed in episode 3, he has a long conversation at the polyglot party with Henry, who becomes a much more important character, and they're relating their experiences among human beings. And we filmed that rather quickly at the end of a night. And we filmed it in a way that then gets repeated in episode 4 when he's talking to the woman who Davy Siegel has, sexually extorted. And that connection. So now you're talking about two scenes, but they're connected and they provide this perspective. And it's eventually going to be revealed why it's important that Henry has been introduced this way. But I like that we were able to connect that through line, of a kind of depravity. And in the vehicle, waiting out front of Melanie's house in episode 4, she asks, are people good? Is life good? Is life worth it? It's a very fundamental question. And as an actor, I don't know how you do it without, because it's a very heavy dialogue. And we played it just so simply and so beautifully. And it landed on Sugar very well. And he had his answer about, have you not been to Paris? And the dog is there and actually participates in the scene. So I love those little subtle things as much as I love designing a big crane shot coming down off the Warner Theater marquee and following Sugar in and then picking up on steady cam all around a room of 200 people. I like that sort of thing as well. So am I proud of that? Yes. Am I proud of subtle scenes in which just one or two performers are given work to do? Yes.
I guess as well, like it will always come down to, as you say, what like plays out in the scene and what it means. I think, as you said, like, yeah, you can have the big flashy scenes with the crane and following Sugar along, or it could be something simple as just two actors having a conversation. I think as like a cinematographer as well, it's like you're quite lucky to be like having like front row tickets to acting master classes sometimes. And it must be so incredible to watch some of these things to be like, did you just see that performance? Can't believe I just saw that like a few meters away from me.
No, I remember working on Requiem for a Dream. I was the operator and I shot all those quick drug cut bits. This is back in 1999. And I remember watching Darren direct Ellen Burstyn. And I would hear, because I'm right at the camera, the direction given, and then I'd see the result in her performance, take after take. And I remember thinking, oh, this is special. This is special work, and she's bringing it every take, every minute. And I remember being very, very moved by that, and so happy that she eventually got an Academy Award nomination for that small film. That was a considerably smaller film than many that were in consideration that year. Deeply moved by what she pulled off in that film. But I'm also very cognizant of the good work on this show. Bernie, Dennis, there's a moment in pretty early in episode 4 where he comes back to his fancy home in the Hollywood Hills and he says to his wife he's been out at the beach house. He's fibbing a little, and then he doesn't want to get right in bed. He wants to go look at old family photos, which is again a theme that then reemerges with the photo of the dress from Winds of Change. And we just lined up very simply on Dennis's face. And often you think to yourself, well, what am I going to do? What do I have to do to make this a better piece of photography? I looked at it and I'm like, I don't have to do anything. Look at it. It's brilliant. And he just, in a silent scene, he brought so much to the depth of story, to saying like, where's his ex-wife? What happened to her? What was the relationship of his daughter to his father that is a corrupt underpinning of the whole story. And so I just credit the performers with being skillful, intuitive, and available to the lens. And then, if everybody's happy with the end result, I'm happy.
And I think that is a perfect note to end this episode. Richard, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you again so much for your time, Richard. Sugar streaming now on Apple TV Plus. Go out and watch Richard and Cesar's work. Thank you again, Richard.
It's my pleasure.
Thank you again. You take care and bye bye.
Cheers, man. Have a good day.
Thank you for listening. Please subscribe, rate, and review this podcast.